Welcome, everyone. I'm Brandon Clifford. I'm the director of the Master of Architecture program here at MIT, and I'd like to begin this evening with our land acknowledgement. MIT acknowledges Indigenous peoples as the traditional stewards of the land and the enduring relationship that exists between them and their traditional territories. The land on which we sit is the traditional unceded territory of the Wampanoag Nation. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced occupation of their territory. And we honor and respect the many diverse Indigenous people connected to this land on which we gather from time immemorial. So I'm thrilled to introduce today's conversation, Blueprints of Justice. MIT's Department of Architecture takes pride in its dedication to design and research. Today's conversation is born out of this very initiative to align our studios with topics that bridge longer-term projects involving ongoing collaborations and threads with existing research projects. And this research studio exemplifies how excellence can be achieved in both design and in research. I'm especially excited to introduce Oana Stănescu, a friend and a revered colleague who will be hosting today's conversation. Juana is an essential enigma within the field of architecture, as her natural inclination is to collaborate, expanding the discipline of architecture while also inviting others in. Her work is simultaneously demanding and lighthearted at the same time, and is developed in partnership with institutions such as MoMA, the New Museum, Nike, Storefront for Art and Architecture, Need Supply, Kanye West, many others, including the members of today's panel. Oana is a traveling pedagogue of sorts. She's teaching with ongoing contributions to schools like Columbia, Cooper Union, the AA in London, Princeton, SciArc, Harvard, and others. And I have to say, we're always really excited to have Oana join us here at MIT. Oana is a pioneer in reimagining the trajectory of architecture and its relationship to other disciplines, to other topics, and most relevant to today, through meaningful collaborations and conversations. So with that, I'd like to pass the mic to Oana, who will be leading us today through Blueprints of Justice. Oana, are you ready?
Very much so. Thank you so much, Brandon. It's always kind of a grueling moment to have to listen to introductions, but really appreciate that. Thank you everyone for joining tonight. I'm really excited about this conversation, and I hope you are too. The context for this conversation is an option studio within MIT Architecture Department, which is done in collaboration with amazing Virgil Abloh, a very dear friend of mine, Nóra Haider from Stanford's Legal Design Lab, and our guest tonight, Sheriece from the Massachusetts court system. So what we do in this option studio is we basically are looking at the current state of the justice system in 2020. You know, it's a system predicated on conservatism and adversity to innovation, in essence, but it was forced into change exactly a year ago, actually. The unusual set of circumstances enabled the instantaneous digitization of the courts, creating a ripple effect that will continue to reverberate over the coming years, if not decades. So we're aiming to take stock of this moment of change and really also investigate a future for hybrid virtual and physical spaces of justice. And we're doing specifically by looking at the Massachusetts court system and working across different scale, spanning from immediate interventions into the Lynn District Court to designing new courthouses in Quincy, a project that's actually currently under development. I'd like at the beginning to, I will share, we're at the beginning of the semester relatively, so we're just kind of ending a research phase, and I'll share a few of those insights in order to kind of set the context for this conversation tonight. But I'm saying that also because I want tonight's conversation to really be the springboard for what's to come and the work that we'll be doing in the coming month. We'll be excited to share that work somewhere around May after the final reviews too. So with that in mind, before I do want to share some of slides, I'd like to also ask my partners in crime tonight to introduce themselves. And I'll maybe pass the baton on to Sheriece Perry.
Good evening, Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. And thank you all for having me here. It's an absolute pleasure to be on such an esteemed panel of you all. It has been a joy so far to look at the work that is being done around architecture and the justice and the intersectionality of all of these different disciplines. And so I come to you from the Massachusetts Trial Court. I am a co-director in support services, but really what I spend my time doing is managing and overseeing our court service centers, which are our self-help centers. There are a number of them throughout Massachusetts. There are 7, but there are also many in different states. California really took the lead on establishing self-help centers for self-represented litigant populations, which are really my true passion to work with, to uplift, to amplify the voices, particularly of those unheard populations of people that are new to this country, that don't speak English as a first language, that are disabled, that are having mental health issues, that are really having challenges engaging and coming into our justice system. So that is my true life's passion. That's what I focus on. And I also, as an attorney, am very passionate about uplifting and bringing more diverse lawyers into the legal field. So thank you all. I am joyed to be here, and I really look forward to our conversation.
Thank you, Sheriece. Virgil, Nóra?
Nóra can go first.
Hi, everyone. I'm super glad to be here and also to continue the work that Virgil and Oana and I started last year. So my name is Nóra. I'm a lawyer and a multidisciplinary researcher. Currently, I'm the policy and design lead at Stanford Legal Design Lab, where I focus the majority of my work on figuring out ways on how we can make a more human-centered legal system that increases access to justice and equity. Virgil, would you like to go next?
Thank you. No, likewise. And I'm honored to be on the panel with esteemed voices as well. My name is Virgil Abloh. I do a lot of things professionally, but I think all are sort of below the title of me just being human and wanting to see the world evolve into a better place than it was when I was born. So my background in design or culture all sort of feeds into sort of research projects like this. I feel that now is a particular time where professional titles don't matter so much as to how we can evolve the world to be a better place. And so with the advent of this coursework and this research work, we're all aiming to do that. And I think that this conversation is one of many beautiful starts to that dialogue. So pleasure to be here.
Thank you all. And thank you, Virgil, also for just mentioning humanity. I think it's something that we're going to keep coming back to, and also unfortunately the lack thereof within the system. So let me just share a few quick slides that I'm going to give you a bit of a insight maybe in some of the research that we've done recently. So we're looking primarily at civil courts and self-litigants and access to justice. And one thing that we hear a lot is the fact that the judicial system is made by lawyers for lawyers. There's not only that factor though, but also that the people that executive leadership engage in the system does not look like and are frankly unfamiliar with the actual users of the system. The way Sarah Glassmeyer put it, for example, she said people in law are the elite and they have no experience with poor people. What you see on the screen is a diagram that shows the family income during childhood for select professions in adulthood. And you can see quite a drastic disparity there. There's of course the cost of education in itself. There's all these different elements that kind of increase the distance between the people in charge really and the users of the courts. There's many other aspects to it too, though. Juries also do not reflect the populations they are meant to be serving. It's important to understand that the issues regarding the civil courts really affect particularly low-income households. You have to imagine that these are, by the way, on this particular slide, these are numbers from 2017. They changed drastically since in the last 4 years, particularly in the last year due to COVID. But 71% of low-income households experience at least one civil legal problem. Out of those 71%, 86% received inadequate or no legal help. One thing that I want to make clear here is that these stats they're official, they're universally recognized by justices, by lawyers, by everyone. They're not rumors, they're not myths, this is the reality of the justice system. It's important to understand that 71% becomes even finer grain once you look at more specific elements, like to give you a sense, in households with survivor of domestic violence or sexual assault, 97% of these households have experienced a civil legal problem in 2017. And also as a descriptor to paint the picture more clearly, also from the same report, 60 million of Americans have a family income at or below 125% of the federal poverty level. And really what that includes is a large majority of a large senior population, people with disabilities, veterans, and many rural residents. To put slightly different, a common stat that we also find very often is the fact that there's basically less than one civil legal aid attorney for every 10,000 Americans living in poverty needing civil legal assistance. The red dots reflect the 10,000 number by comparison to the one, to just kind of give a sense of the magnitude of these numbers. There is a justice index. And Massachusetts is doing on a composite level its second highest composite score, so it's doing quite well, which is actually rather jarring considering that a lot of other states are doing a lot worse. We said we're looking particularly at Quincy and Lynn. It gives you a sense of where they are on the map, and part of these studies, and I'm really just kind of trying to go through a few of them, implies looking at the demographics, implies understanding who the court users are, looking at it from all sorts of different perspectives. For example, in Lynn, out of every 100 people, around 10 people have a disability. But also with regards to the issue of language, you can see that in Lynn, there is a significantly higher proportion of residents who speak English less than very well at 23.9%, so almost a quarter of the population, compared with the state's 9.1%. So who are the court users? What's interesting with this is data is oftentimes missing. Massachusetts actually has a pretty comprehensive collection of data. However, it operates at a state level and we don't know much about the individual courts. I do want to make clear that many other states, in many other cases, the data itself does not even exist, therefore no insight in the actual users. This slide shows you the race and ethnicity of court users in Massachusetts versus the percentage reflected by the employees in the Massachusetts trial court at all levels, and looking at justices. One other interesting information is understanding that 64% out of the people in requesting civil legal aid are turned away due to the lack of resources. These are problems called out by justices, so determined by justices themselves, problems due to the lack of professional representation. So in which particular courts, for example, housing courts has a 60%, family matters around 50, and so on and so forth. And this is from the justice's perspective. What happened now with COVID, we went digital, courts went also digital, everyone was improvising, winging it. Digital there is also the digital divide that we're familiar with. So if you start looking at the access to digital means, it can vary drastically depending on one's resources. But outside of that too, navigating the digital world is quite different, not as straightforward as one would necessarily imagine. This is a chart trying to outline pretty much the ideal case of circumstances through which a process like contacting the courts would actually happen. if I learned anything from dealing with, from working with Nóra and dealing with lawyers, is that the answer to every single question you're going to ask is depends. So this chart is extremely optimistic. The reality of it looks a little bit more like this. Once you start searching, the rabbit holes are kind of expanding. Of course, the digital divide also implies the fact that a lot of these technologies cost things. It's never just a phone or just a computer. There's a kind of chain reaction of resources that any of these imply, many of us taking them for granted. However, there are also a series of digital barriers that even if one has the technology, they can still come across. And more important, I think it's crucial to understand that technology is not neutral. It never has been. In addition to that, there's a virtual bias. It's not a single one. These are just a couple of the aspects through which virtual bias can manifest itself. These are all obstacles that are keeping people from having true access to justice. In addition to that, on the other side, the courts can oftentimes be locked into contracts with providers of technology. And because the going digital was so instantaneous, there was a lot of improvisation. The courts themselves lack proper digital infrastructure, both for their users, but also for the people within the system, oftentimes using an overwhelming and unclear kind of set, an improvised set of tools. And when we come to physical buildings and physical spaces, this is a quote from Justice Julie Bernard. She's quite amazing. And in her own words, most courthouses are just blah. It's a pretty accurate description. We look particularly at Lynn, but one thing that we hear over and over and over again is that courthouses are built, they're outdated. They are outdated oftentimes by the time they open already. And they're difficult places. In this particular case, looking at Lynn and just showing one graph, it shows some of the conflicts and some of the code violations in the very courthouse that is supposed to be enforcing code essentially. But many of the questions that were raised that are quite interesting are with regards to whether courthouses can really be true neutral public ground again. And can they be open to a future that is evolving and to the times that are evolving too. This diagram maybe reflects some of the, or summarizes some of the many barriers faced by the court users. So with that in mind, I do want to also thank this entire list of amazing people, from Justice Julie Bernard to Sarah Glassmeyer, to the student body, to Rhoda, Nóra, and Mariana, and to many of the other speakers who joined us. So I want to open the conversation now, and I'll just put a question out there. It's 1 year almost to the day since the COVID shutdown, and we talked a lot about how at the beginning courts really were winging it. Everyone was kind of improvising. What is really unprecedented about this moment in time is the change within an extremely change-averse system, right? So 1 year later, there seems to be this daunting feeling that the urgency, or this kind of urgency that the door is closing on this moment of change. And that there's huge pressures to return to the previous status quo or to try to reinforce it. Sheriece, I'm curious, how did you experience the storm this year? What does it mean how does it look from your position, from within the system?
So taking into consideration everything you've talked about, really about the technology gaps and the divide, particularly for self-represented litigant population and all of the people that we see in the court service center. We're talking to people that fit the exact demographic that has the challenges interfacing with the court. And so for our operations, we were exclusively in person. We wanted to sit with people, we wanted to talk with them, we wanted to help them complete forms, we wanted to do soft handoffs, walking them to departments. And so it completely disrupted our operations when we had to stop. And it made it very, very hard to kind of identify, what do we do when we have such a inefficient technology infrastructure within the organization, right? We have contracts with technology companies, but we didn't have laptops. and there weren't a lot of them. Laptops were hard to come by management staff. We didn't have cell phones at home. We didn't have all of these things that would have really allowed us to pivot to having a place where we could provide services. In addition to that, people don't have computers at home to fill out court forms, right? And so when they need to go online and fill out a form, they can't do that on their own. They can't print out things, they can't scan documents and email them into the court. So when everything shifted, lawyers could go into their offices and do that, but people that needed restraining orders because of domestic violence situations, people that were being harassed for not being able to pay their rent, even though the eviction moratorium kicked in, it was really, really hard to figure out ways. But I mean, we used Text Now, which was a free app, and said, how do we get phone numbers? And we just like flyers. I mean, I almost felt like I'm not in a court system. I'm literally just going to set up an operation. And, my managers jumped right in and said, let's flyers, Text Now numbers. They shared them. And then when we realized this wasn't over, and we weren't going to just be able to like reopen the doors a couple months later and go back to business as usual, it was, what do we do now? I can't wait for procurement laws to kick in and contracts to be signed. So it was Google, it was Zoom, it was Excel spreadsheets. And we really just kind of like figured out, how do we create a system that really mimics what we did in person? And that's what we did. And, we had to use some of the law. So realizing that people couldn't submit documents, reached out to the Supreme Judicial Court and said, can you give us authority to sign on people's behalf and keep really strong data so that we can get people access to our system, completed court forms, all within the rules and the guidelines and the statutes and the CMRs and all of that stuff, and do it the right way. But how do we serve as a bridge in terms of access to justice for that population? So it's certainly been difficult. We've started to get more of the things that we need, but for us to go from in-person to technology like immediately was very, very hard for us.
I remember one thing you mentioned in one of the early lectures or talks that we had, and you said you're the kind of just do it and ask for forgiveness later. That really stayed with me. How do you feel on kind of more secure footing now, 1 year in, or are things still very much tumultuous?
No, I think as the time went on and we realized, and the institution really realized that, one, we have to pick up in terms of our IT infrastructure. And that happened immediately. The IT department, figured out, how do we, with all of these competing demands, corporate offices are buying laptops, everyone's buying laptops, how do we get the technology that we need? And now, as we've been coming up to this year, it's, well, now that we've added this technology, this is actually serving a large population of people as well, right? The folks that used to have to pack up and, take time off of work, right? A lot of people aren't in positions to take time off of work and miss that income because they're not salaried. So it really helped where people could be home. You have children that are home and they're being educated. So, they can't just leave and go in physically. So the technology aspect has certainly improved a lot of access and assisted, but we have to figure out a way to do both at this point. And I think that where we are now is identifying, how do we ensure that we have a presence in person for those people that need services in person, but how do we also ensure that we have services available through technology? And the timing has really been right, because the court has submitted an IT bond bill to the legislature asking for a lot of, lots of money to be able to provide that, that infrastructure, while also looking at, clearly the physical makeup of the buildings, ones that need to be renovated, as well as the one, to be completely designed in Quincy. And then whatever comes out in the future, because architecture is really important, and we really looked at that too.
One of the things that I find most fascinating is we talk a lot about the legal system is designed for lawyers, by lawyers, but the ironic thing about it is that the legal system doesn't work well for lawyers either, or legal professionals or judges. judges suffer from an overburdened caseload. There are so many lawyers suffering from stress and anxiety as well. And I find this kind of fascinating when we talk about this, because if it was designed by lawyers, then it's a really bad design. And it reminds me of this phrase coined by Adriana Brown. I don't know if you've read her work, but she talks about the battle of imagination. So according to her, the battle of imagination is basically an idea, an imaginative idea that is not based in truth, it's subjective, but reality is formed around it. For example, the notion that men are superior to women, not based in reality at all, but someone imagined it one day and a reality was structured around it. And sometimes I feel that way when I look at the legal system as well, because someday, somewhere in history, someone came up with how the legal system should be structured, but the thoughts behind it, the idea, the way they came up with it is archaic in a way. So I find it really fascinating when we talk about the legal system as well. And her solution in that way is basically what we're doing now. It's co-imagination or collaborative imagination, inviting people in from different disciplines, and then trying to reimagine how reality should look like, reimagine the ideas that, for example, the legal system is based on. Sheriece, I think, would you be willing to talk a bit more about the report that recently came out in Massachusetts about the well-being of lawyers? Because I found it really fascinating.
Sure. So, I mean, that was an incredible report. And, you know, as a Black attorney, one of the organizations that participated, I was certainly one of the presidents of, but, you know, our experiences as affinity bar attorneys, Black attorneys, Latinx attorneys, LGBTQ, attorneys with disabilities, et cetera. You know, our experiences really mimic those of court users, right? You know, we often walk into courthouses and we are mistaken as the court, you know, court users, right? You know, you get stopped, you know, there's sections in courthouses that say these are for lawyers. And then you go to walk into that lawyer space and someone tells you to stop. As a family law practitioner, the firm I worked at represented a lot of dads. So I would come in to check in and, oh, your mom, right? Not even, it didn't matter the suit that I had on, none of that mattered. It was, oh, your mom. And so you have these experiences, and these experiences are real. And they've been going on for years, and they've been talking about them for years. But I think the concern is always when you bring things to, you know, the attention, there's the question about, I bring this up and I have to practice in that court the next day. I complain about a judge, but then I have to go before that judge and still hope that I get the same fair treatment, right? Because not that my career necessarily is on the line, but my clients, right? Is my client going to get a different treatment because I raised an issue relative to how the judge treated me, or thinking something was unfair, or called into question any of that. And so, you know, I know lawyers that have disability issues. I know lawyers that are in wheelchairs, and they have challenges coming through, right? The court is the, you know, do the handicap accessible doors open? Are the doors too heavy? Lawyers speak different languages, you know, they come from different cultures. How are they being treated as they come in? And so, you know, yes, it's great that, you know, you feel that you've received and you've gotten this particular degree and profession, but you still feel, again, as a representative of an oppressed and marginalized population of people, that you still don't get the same level of respect when you walk into the court system. And so, you know, I am glad the report came out, and I am happy at the court's response to it. It wasn't something that was hidden. For sure, it was something that was immediately released to all trial court personnel, and everyone got together to have the chiefs and all of them got together to have a conversation, and they're going to have a conversation with all of those affinity bars to identify, you know, what do we do? You know, there's been some training for judges as well, because as you mentioned, the human part of this is, as court users are human, judges are human, right? They have been lawyers, they have years of experience, they have they have lived experiences, but they're human too. And the decisions that they make are going to be rooted in their own lived experiences. And, you know, when you look at who judges are, when you walk into courthouses, you bring students, you talk to them, you often see portraits of white men in courthouses, right? And so that's who really ruled the law for years and years and years and years. And time has certainly changed, but there are a lot of entrenched systemic racism that still exists in our system. And, it was created, it is what it is, but at this point, it's time to really just, you want to dismantle, but it's really like you just got to throw it away and rebuild it, because there's no real way to kind of take all of these experiences and fix everything that happens. You have to really rebuild that into something greater, and something that's representative of where we are today and where we're going to be in the future, because diversity is real, equity and inclusion is real, but it's slow. Everything is slow. It's slow, slow, slow. And we're still making first, and there's still judges that are not representative of the population that they serve. We still don't have enough and sufficient equity, even within our judges and what they do. We don't have, we feel that there are reports, and, you have the Harvard study that came out about the disparities. Massachusetts may not be a state that deals with mass incarceration, but we certainly know that the numbers tell us that Black and Brown people are disproportionately impacted by our Massachusetts court system, right? And so that is real. And it's not so much what the numbers say, it's what are we gonna do about what the numbers say? And I always have forever loved Jay-Z's quote, like, men lie, women lie, numbers don't. And the numbers are what the numbers are, but what are we doing about the numbers? What are we doing about people's experiences? And what are we gonna do to actually change all of that, and have a real plan about how we're changing that.
I really appreciate you also talking about the dismantling of the system, because one of the many kind of late night conversations I'm having with Nóra and Virgil are really about the struggle with working within the system. Like, you're trying to contribute, but in essence, you don't necessarily believe in the system, right? Like, you're trying to cause change, and there's this kind of fear of working within the system. Can you actually undo it from within? And the fear of not kind of moving the needle enough. And I think there's certain aspects that we're refusing to come to terms with and accept, like certain aspects of the justice. Whenever, whenever I hear the term of holding cell or detention, it's not anything that I ever want to get comfortable with. But in the same time, like, in a way, we're hoping to also, with this, reinforcing conversation with students and everyone, that we're trying to question the root of the issue and not just its surface manifestation. And I mean, I feel, Virgil, this speaks to a lot of your experience too, because you're navigating different world and systems, and working within different world and different systems that also require their own restructuring or have their own reckoning.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think, all the data and the points that Nóra and Sheriece have made about getting us even closer to the context is powerful. And, for me, the systems work that I've done throughout my career gives me a unique perspective to think on these broad terms. And, like, let's just take this conversation for a nutshell, right? It was introduced by acknowledging that the land that this lecture is being broadcast from was, I think in the words was sort of like, aggressively, or, just replaced, forcefully displaced people that lived on it. And so for me, it's important to just dwell on that. Like, imagine us being in our places, and imagine someone coming at the door saying, like, where you're at is ours now. And in order to reinforce that sentiment, they need some sort of system to do that, right? Like, just think practically, because history is not something that it goes into our trash bin and just goes away. It's literally how we ended up to have this conversation where we're at today. But I think it's important for our generation, even in this, latest civil rights movement of 2020, to acknowledge how we are linked to our history, and that our history doesn't disappear as much as, like, life continues on. So you need they needed systems to sort of keep that intact. And what do? You make laws. And so those laws are rooted in this like very considered moment of like, okay, we need to make order out of people whose land this isn't theirs anymore. Like, how do we do that? And when I hear like disproportionate numbers, and when I hear that the whole system is within question, it's like, it's linked to our past. And so we, as like a more informed generation, we can hopefully at least feel that something is wrong, that people from multiple sides of the aisle need to come together and bring their brains together, which is what this coursework is, and is the context for the, you know, the four of us speaking right now. And so I've always operated off this quote from Buckminster Fuller that every system operates exactly as it was designed to be, which is a little bit of a conundrum, because you want to hear at the end of that, like, wait, every system that's designed can be better or whatever. And what he's saying is like, it was designed to operate exactly as it is, which is, for lack of a better way of describing it, a mess. And we as human beings should just make this one leap, in my mind. Just make this leap about not having to guess you were right and hold on to it. It's not a football game. It's not, there's no bet, right? And I think that light commitment to being like, wait, it's always been done this way. If we change it, that doesn't mean that more crimes are going to happen and the city is going to be like unruly. And I think a lot of people hold on to it being like, this is the way it was done. This is the way it has to be. If we don't do it like that, our cities aren't safe and we're not well protected. But if you just put that off to the side for one moment and go back to the quote, it's like, this system was designed, just as Nóra explained it, she used better words than I could, was just based on a guess, right? And it was based on way less people with way less knowledge about that historical moment of how we ended up here. Now that we can see that there's this disproportion, let's use the moment of the pandemic, 2020, the Enlightenment, to use these technological sort of systems, just as Sheriece has built a new infrastructure that's basically putting a wedge within the existing and helping people. So, you know, I firmly believe in the premise. And just to end on that sentiment is like, you know, I once heard that like all government systems should have an artist as a seat. And I thought, and it might have been something that was just like an imagination. Or I think it was something about like the way that, like a theory of about how systems could be in place. But I just love that if we're making the new future, if we're wiping the slate clean, and it's up to us and our generation here within MIT, or us, you know, leading this coursework, I think that if we take that chip about not holding on to the past, I'm confident that we can use this millennial spirit, we can use the internet, we can use people coming from all sides of the different aisles to come up with solutions that bring us a lot further than the existing way of evolving systems.
You know, the one thing that I always have a hard time sort of understanding is the desire for people to reinforce the status quo and to maintain it when the numbers, to both of your points, are just so glaringly unjust, right? And so the desire to maintain a justice system that is unjust doesn't make sense to me. But I also sense my own limitation there because I'm sure I have that understanding of the world because of my own lived experience, to everyone's point. And you know, there's some really interesting conversations that happened in the last days or weeks with the students too. And one thing I want to bring it back to that you just mentioned, Virgil, was I'm curious to hear from any of you on it, is well, basically, I think on the one hand, after all this research and taking all the information in, I think on the one hand, there was a sense of being overwhelmed. And I remember having that in fall too, when we started kind of getting deep into it, because it's just overwhelming. And I have so much respect for your work, Sheriece, and you know, all people working within the system. It's really, it's hard. It's really hard work. And on the other hand, I think there was a sense, a bit of a, I think, fear on everyone's side of not being able to address the issue properly. It's a bit of like, well, everything is so bummed. What's interesting is architecture was identified as part of the problem, but not necessarily as part of the solution. And I think to me that what that meant, that what they reflected was in a way that our maybe somewhat the fact that our perception at times of architecture as architects, as architecture students, and so on and so forth, is our own perception of our skill set or of architecture can be so limited that we don't see what's in front of us. If it's part of the problem, why can't it be part of the solution? And it's not that architecture is going to change, you know, solve all the justice system. Nothing's going to change the entire justice system just like that. But it was interesting, and it tied, sorry, where I was going at, what you reminded what you said with regards to not holding on to the idea of being right. And one of the conversation with the students were like saying that, you know, I'm kind of uncomfortable with this. There was a lot of soul searching in a way. And we're just talking about, but this is awesome. Like, can we thrive in that moment of soul searching? Can we not lose the soul searching? That should be the basis of every conversation. And can we be comfortable not knowing the outcome of things? Can we be comfortable exploring these issues and not having to claim that position of, ta-da, here's here's everything you want for and then some? Can we not can we be comfortable, can we be more humble with what we have to bring to the table, and not try to claim more territory that's necessary, but also can we not misunderstand architecture for more than it truly is?
Yeah, I think it's good for the listeners, is not like you and I both practice, you know, architecture doesn't mean bricks. And it doesn't mean construction sites. You know, architecture is Sheriece finding one more laptop to service 10 more people on half of a day. You know, like that's important for any new listener. But I'm going to digest your question and throw it to Sheriece and Nóra. And I think it's helpful for all of us to learn, those who are in the practice. Like, I think that a large amount of the public and the people trying to have guessed right and not change their mind has this theory that if we rework the system or redesign it, that, and for lack of a better way of describing it, that all of a sudden the streets will be filled with criminals and the world would be unsafe. And I think it's important. I want to hear you both sort of from practicing, if we saw the numbers change from what they disproportionately are now to more proportionate. I'd love to hear you guys think or say about what the lay person might be getting wrong about us in this practical notion of revising the system.
You'd like to go first, Sheriece? Okay. So I think that's a very good question, and it comes back to the first question that I also asked students when we started the class: what is justice? What is justice according to you? And I can tell you that when you ask this question to 10 people, you'll get 10 different answers. And what's more interesting is what you perceive as justice depends on your cultural background, your socioeconomic background. So we spent a bit of the class talking about different concepts of justice around the world. And I'm going to bring this example back up because it illustrates basically what Oana and I are trying to do as well, what Sheriece is working on, and what Virgil is working on as well. So in Rwanda, after the genocide, the local community set gacaca courts up there. And the concept of justice was very different from what we see as justice. There were no prisons. The concept of the gacaca court was for both the abuser and the victim to be in the same space, loosely defined, and listen to each other and hear each other out and hear an apology taking place so that the victim can be heard and can be seen. So while I was telling this to students, I was looking up any clips so that they can see how that concept of justice works, because it's very different. It's not in a fancy old building with really old people saying that this is law, now you go to prison. So I was watching this documentary, and an academic, a legal scholar, comes in from the UK and asks the judge, well, how can you say that this is justice? You're not in a court building. There are no prisons. What are you actually doing? And the judge replies by saying, you have substance and you have form. If we agree upon the substance, equity, being heard, accountability, then does form really matter? And that's basically the question that we're also laying out in the design studio. Sheriece, would you like to add?
The concept, it's such a hard concept to dissect because, you know, as Nóra just said, who defined what justice is, right? Like who determined what justice is? And, you know, when you look at justice was man-made, you know, laws are man-made. Everything is essentially man-made, and the idea that we can't change things. I think the reality is that the systems are in place to do, as Virgil said, to do what they were set to do. And there is a huge population of people, and we have to acknowledge that racism still exists. We have to acknowledge that there are people that literally want certain populations of people to remain oppressed. We know that, right? And we have to know that those same exact people still exist in our systems. They are, they are judges, they are legislators, they are politicians, they are academic professors. So the reality is that as we try to change systems, it's not just that we want to change the system on the ground up. There are people that are actually pushing progress down. So every step that we make, there's someone on the other end that's going to push back because they actually don't want the systems to change. And that's the challenge here, right? Right. If we could, with a stroke of a pen, say, give us all this money, change all of this stuff, we would do it. But as we'll see at the conclusion of all of this work is that one court wants one thing, one person wants another thing. You have the intersectionality in our system of, you have people that have been court appointed, that are appointed. You have people that have been elected by constituents. You have people that have been appointed by the governor, right? And they all have competing interests. And so while we sit here and we want to be able to do things through the perspective of a court user, because that is what is right to do, right? Those are our people. Those are the folks that walk into our institution. We know that, we have that in mind, but we have all of these other competing interests that are impacting our ability to really do that and do it in a way that creates change expeditiously, like quickly, you know. We make change, and I've tried within my departments to make really small changes, like with COVID and going from, you know, in person to online. But even as I create, you know, I opened a brand new court service center in Lowell in the middle, right at the beginning of the pandemic. And as I opened Boston, which was one of the first ones, to the seventh one, it was, what are people's experience? Like, that was the first thing that came to my mind when they walk through the self-help center, the court service center, and ask for help. What does that experience look like, right? What do the chairs look like? Do they roll? You know, do they account for people and their physical sizes? Do we have sit to stand tables to ensure that our tables are handicap accessible, right? What are the colors on the wall? You know, when the space first, it was ugly, it was green, and I was like, in white walls, it looked like a hospital, right? I want people to walk into a court service center and know that the people are there to help them. And it's not just because we're there to help. You know, it was, I don't want you wearing suits. I want you dressed in, you know, professionally, but because we're in a courthouse, but not suits. I want people to feel comfortable when they walk in here. You know, we have schools that provided artwork that was on the wall, that was, you know, the 8th graders, and that all, you know, the walls, the children's spaces are in court service centers, right? Because people come to court with children. You know, what are the staff? Do they speak different languages? You know, this isn't just walking, you know, it's just not one in a narrow way of approaching justice and approaching how we help people. This was, who are all of the people that are going to walk in here, and how do we ensure that we meet all of their needs, not just one person's need or one population's need, all of their needs, and be able to do that in a respectful way. You can move the tables, you can put people together, you can do all of that. And all of that, as Virgil said, is architecture, right? You're thinking about all of these different things, but the only person that I thought about at every single moment was, who are we serving? And that is the mindset that you have to really change when you create systems, when you change systems. Who are we serving? Technology is great, but who else are we, who doesn't have access to technology? And what do we do? What do we need to do here on our end in the court system to ensure the population of people that don't have access to technology at home can come into our system, and they can get access to technology in our system, so that the playing field is level for them as well.
Sheriece, one thing that really stood out to me in the conversation that I found extremely touching, when you were talking about Chief Justice Gant and his passing. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, about working with him?
You know, his passing, I think, affected a lot of people. It always tears me up because he was and he used his privilege. And I don't think people really understand, for a white man to come into a system and to use his privilege as such to address these issues. You know, you would never imagine a Chief Justice saying, I want an outside institution to come in and tell me how terrible our criminal justice system is functioning. I want to open the doors to that. The conversation that I did with the Boston Bar Association in December about amplifying unheard voices, he specifically said, I want to have a conversation. I want there to be a conversation about the experience of Black and Latinx court users when they come into our system. Let's talk about it. You know, he brought up issues as it relates to judicial diversity, lawyer diversity. You know, every single issue that we have talked about has really been that. And, you know, it has been so heartbreaking for so many months to really just think about all of the loss and all that is not here, right? You really need someone at the helm that truly understands that, but doesn't just understand it in theory, but actually understands it in practice and moves the needle. You know, he's the one that is going to apply that pressure from the bench on the issues that really matter. And I think that that is what we really and truly lost. You know, we gained a tremendous champion in Chief Justice Budd. And, you know, we will continue to push this issue forward. But he worked hard. He worked zealously for this very population. And, you know, I think there are a lot of people such as myself that are just kind of trying to continue to do good work and hope that, you know, he continues to smile down on everyone that is doing, you know, that is doing his work and is continuing to move the conversation on race, on access to justice issues, particularly on the civil legal side, because that area has always been left behind. There's no right to counsel. There's no civil Gideon, as we call it. You know, resources are always very slim, as you highlighted at the beginning of this presentation. But he talked about it, and he talked about it over and over and over and over again, because he meant it. And he wanted to make sure that people that had privilege really used it to raise these issues. And I think that that's why a lot more issues, I'm sure that that was a lot of the impetus behind even the affinity bar study. I'm sure at some point he came up with an idea and he said, you know what, I think we should hear from the affinity bar associations. And that's all it took. You know, people knew when he said, I have an idea, he wasn't going to tell you how to do it. He was just going to, you know, send an email or have a call with somebody and say, I have an idea about something, or send an email. This is an issue here. And then you literally just got to work.
Thank you for sharing that. I thought it was so important in the way you presented it or talked to us about it. And I wanted, one thing that I wanted to speak to Virgil's previous question, you know, when you asked about the system, and what we realized again in conversations in class is that the system very much currently operates under the worst case scenario, like expecting literally the worst in people. And what we're trying to ask ourselves, well, can we work within the best case scenario? Can we not prepare for the worst, but really can we hope for the best, but also try to enable in a way the best? And it raises interesting questions. For example, it's some of the issues for that don't work in the building implies that the justices have to share parking with detainees. And in a way, we're like, well, maybe that's not so bad. Why can't they share parking? Because they're not.
Virgil laughed.
Yeah.
They're people, right? Like, can we not see? You use the word criminals, and I was like, well, many of them might not even be guilty. Many of them just can't afford $100 bail. But anyway, chances are they are with police and everything. Like, why can't that space be shared? So it's interesting in a way when I think some mistakes or errors in the system actually reveal potential for improvement. Why are you laughing, Virgil?
I love how you set up things in a diplomatic way, but a pointed. You always tuck the core of the matter, even when you're like laying out what is a dated like logic, and I think, if you summarize what we're all saying is like this optimism, right? Despite reality. And we're trying, and we are doing through our actions, but we're wording this possibility that things can be more human. Nóra brought it up in her Rwanda example, and Sheriece brought it up in the 8th grader. That was such a beautiful picture painted of like a taupe wall instead of white or green and an 8th grader's artwork. And it seems radical, but it also seems better, right? And then that's that thing of not holding on to the guess of what a courtroom looks like, what the judge's uniform should look like, and this holy space should distribute law. And then there's like a noise should come out when law is presented. It's like, let's foster our optimism. What my work focuses on is the other end of the scale of justice. Like, there's this courtroom and there's these few people that are deciding. Then there's this whole outside world where people are living their day-to-day lives, trying to feel like they're in organization, like they're in a lawful society. And that means they can freely be free. Well, that side of the scale, just as Sheriece mentioned, it's like full of racist. It's full of all other vast sort of like ills that play within society that hide under the surface that are our daily lives. And so I think that while work is being done on that's why it's perfect we're conversating, because for me it's like the social norms, right? The 24-hour news cycle. Like, if you read, we all know what the news cycle is this last 24 hours, the most horrific, and rest in peace to those that lost their lives in Atlanta. But for the community, these topics have been the topics. It's just no one put them on the 24-hour cycle. And once you put them on the cycle, then people can start sharing stories and having dialogue. So for me, both work is important. Since we know it's going to take time, we know that it's an uphill battle. We know that it's not meant to change overnight. But I believe that if you change the societal norms, if pop culture with a youthful society says, hey, do unto my neighbor as I want to be done to myself, that Rwanda court, or the room that Sheriece is making for people who are just simply filing a restraining order to stay safe. They're not a criminal. They're just, because they walk in and the security guard thinks that they're of the dissent and have the clothes, that they're going to be, like you said, detention center. Let's our generation remain optimistic. That's what this coursework is doing at MIT, and the ones previously between Stanford and Harvard, that's the glimmer of hope. To me, that's tangible, like it's malleable. And, I'm excited to see what the students and obviously what we all sort of curate of this ready, willing, and able body of thinkers.
So,
sorry, go ahead.
no, it's that, I think that human part of this work is, I think that I can't even think of the word, the human component to the law is missing. It's just, it is completely gone, right? I think that there are people that work and represent people, right? When I thought about law, I thought I was gonna go be in corporate world, right? And then I got to law school and I realized that the passion was working for the people and working with people because of the human component to it. And that part was really what is missing. You walk into a building and it's like, you feel like you're walking into an art gallery and you're waiting for the sign that says, do not touch. And that's how people feel when they walk into courthouses, particularly new ones, because they're beautiful. They're aesthetically pleasing, but they're not welcoming, right? They don't scream, we are here to help you. There are, it's the signage doesn't say, we're here to help you. We don't have people that have little stickers on that say, what can I help you with, right? We don't have that. So it's one of those things where people are walking in and you almost feel like, if I don't say anything, no one's going to ask me, can I help you? No one's going to say to you, like, how do we change that, right? People are stressed. They're taking public transportation. They're getting to courthouses. They're overwhelmed. They have to literally undress, they go through, they got to take belts off. They have to do all of this just to walk into a courthouse to file for a restraining order to protect their livelihood, right? Like, just think about that in your mind. That's what people have to go through. And then when you look at no cell phone policies in courthouses, that was one of the major changes that happened, where we had no cell phone policies, particularly in courthouses that had civil courts. So where's the access? I have medical records, or I have all of this stuff on a phone, but because there's a no cell phone policy in that building, I can't even bring my proof or my evidence into the courthouse. And I have to go through this process just to apply for a restraining order. So I really think that human component has to come back to what is it that we are doing. And right before we ended with, and we left the space where the detention is and the parking lot where the transport comes in and the detainees and the judges park, we just kind of closed out with the facilities manager there. And he said, I am not a high ranking person in this court system. My job is to manage this building and make sure it's clean. And my thing is, regardless of why people are coming in through this portion, right? He's talking about transport. My job is to make sure that they walk into a clean, the clean lockup area that, he had talked about the work that they have to do every time an detainee comes in to make sure it's COVID sterilized. But before that, it's my job, and he felt it was his job to ensure that the space was clean and people could come into this space. And that was his job. And he owned it, and he felt like it was part of ensuring the human part of the services that he is providing. And so people that think like that I don't know why this person's here. I don't know why they're in lockup. I don't know why they're coming into this courthouse. I don't know what they did. It doesn't matter. But what I want to make sure is that they feel treated like respect, the space is clean, and whatever they're here for, they're here for. And I think people need to start to think about, when people walk into the front of the courthouse, when they walk into that door, people are human and they're dealing with real life situations. And we have to really treat people like such. And we need to be kind and we need to be courteous, because I've been preaching kindness for so long, particularly in this climate, but kindness goes a long way. It truly does.
And now you mentioned at one point dignity of respect as being one of your kind of goals, dignity and respect for all users. And I think about that a lot, and how everyone just wants the basic respect that they deserve, and how that is why that is such a difficult thing to accomplish. And what you just said now also reminds me of Sarah Glassmeyer's quote. She said something along the lines of, we asked for advice, and she said just, gather as many differences and forms of humanity as you possibly can. And you touched on it too, with saying that lived experiences are real and they don't find their way into the system. And what I thought was super interesting in that is, on the one hand, we have a very rigid system that just doesn't take into account the fabric of life. And I think we're feeling it now hard, like, stronger than ever, because our lives have been changing dramatically in the last 10 years, but even more so in the last year too. And on the other hand, there's the same critique for architectures though too. These are rigid old buildings that did not take into account the different fabrics of life and different uses and evolution. So it just keeps me thinking a lot about how can we design and how both systems, both spaces, systems, without fixing things, without limiting things, but kind of making room for differences, for variation, for flexibility. But I think it's more than for flexibility, it's for desired futures. And how do we not just hold on to the present, but just make room for desired futures within systems and within our buildings. We're gonna open it slowly for questions from the public. Everyone, do feel free to ask away in the web chat, and Mariana, I think you can start sharing some of the questions for us. Meanwhile, if Virgil or Nóra want to speak to any of that. Okay, I'll read the first question. Where do you think lies the power of sharing personal accounts, anecdotes, and the ability to enact change within the justice system? And how can we better position and elevate stories such as they can bring most effective toward enacting change?
You know, it's hard. You know, you have to have a system that wants to hear and that wants to listen and is open to that. And I think that as time has gone on, particularly the Massachusetts court system has, I mean, we've embarked on now keeping track of diversity. Now, you know, the affinity bar, and again, the report, I don't, but it was a report and it came out and it was about what are the issues, right? For Black History Month, we've never, and there's probably not a court system that has ever put the Chief Justices, you know, in a Zoom room webinar like this and said, we are going to open up the system to comments and the public. And so on February 22nd, we held a public forum and we had all of the Chief Justices on the panel, and we brought in people from the public and they asked questions. You know, they asked questions about probation. They asked questions about, you know, fear that as a Black man, I have a Black son, and my concern is, you know, is he going to get fair treatment? They asked, you know, there were a whole host of things. And so that has to be the momentum moving forward. We have to continue to engage and be transparent. But be open to hearing from people, because a lot of judicial systems will not open themselves up in that particular way. And, you know, a lot of that credit comes to, you know, Chief Justice Gans was on there for 6 years. He said, we're going to open up the floodgates to anything and everything. You know, I want to hear what people have to say. And then what do we do with what the people have to say? And I think we are at a point in which we have to start to hear what people have to say, and we have to start to implement the things that people are saying. You know, if there's an issue relative to how attorneys interface, if there's an issue regarding language access, right? We have a language access plan, and a lot of work is going into how do we ensure that people that speak different languages, particularly in communities where courthouses are, of particular languages, right? So Lowell has a huge Cambodian population. There needs to be signage in Khmer, right? That exists now. You know, Framingham is on the list of courts to be changed, but that started as a population that was primarily Spanish speaking. That's why a lot of the signage is in Spanish. However, that's a Portuguese, that has a huge Portuguese population. So now that signage has to change, right? And so not only do we have to listen and be open to hearing what people have to say, but we actually have to change the things that they are bringing to our attention and do it in a way that is rooted in their experience, not so much in what is best for the institution, but is rooted in the experience of the people that are walking through our doors, right? So if people have safety issues, if it's handicap accessibility issues, those are the things that we have to actually change versus just kind of saying, oh, we know. We are at a really kind of pivotal point in which a lot of that is happening, and a lot of the external perspectives and voices and feedback and suggestions are really being heard. And, you know, I'm hopeful and optimistic that that will continue to change, but that's where it starts.
One for the architects. One question. Thank you, Sheriece, for the answer. Is saying the next question is for the architect. Architecture seems like it can have some impact on reforming the justice system, but not enough impact by itself to truly make meaningful change. What do you think is the most valuable asset that architects can bring to reforming the justice system? Is it our physical architectural solutions, our way of thinking and approaching problems, or is it something else? I really appreciate this question. Actually, it's not for architects, which is great. But I was going to ask you the same thing, Sheriece, because you welcomed us with open arms, and we're so mindful of your time, but you really shared and opened things up for us. And I think on everyone's mind is just how can we best, what can we bring to the table? How can we?
So if I go back to, you know, what Virgil said, and he gave the example of if, you know, architecture is, you know, having one computer to serve 10 people, right? And I'm probably restating this all wrong. So, but the reality is that type of vision, right? When we talk about rigidity and how we see things, it's always very narrow, right? People see things through black, white, not gray. We don't see gray, we don't see blue, green, purple, and all these other colors, right? Architects do. And architects are often visionaries. They see things that we don't, that sometimes we don't see because we've been trained to think the law is 4 corners of a document. It's white pages with black lettering. And so when you often have in systems very kind of rigid ways that they do things, but you also have people that don't like change and are accustomed to the things being the way that they are. So when you bring in individuals such as architects who are visionaries, who are people that see things that no one else sees, they bring a different perspective and they bring a different light to the conversation so that they can think about what is, you know, if we do one thing, what does this impact? If we change the way that a space is organized and set up, what does that do? When we add color, what impact does that have, right? The colors change people. You know, we used to, like, if you were going to court and you were on trial, they used to tell you wear a blue suit. Women, they used to tell you wear skirt suits, right? I don't know who made this stuff up, but we know that experiences, and we particularly know colors do something for people. You know, I've often read, you know, you wear this color if you do this, you wear that color if you do that. But those are the things, and I think that oftentimes people, they see, but they don't have sight, right? They don't see further than just what is really in front of them. And I think that that is the energy and that is the light that we really need, because if you look at buildings, as I said at the beginning, they are one way. They literally all look the same in different ways. They're aesthetically pleasing, but they don't serve what they need to serve. You know, who said they all had to be marble floors and the benches had to be affixed to the wall so that they couldn't go anywhere? You know, what happened to things moving and tables moving and you know, the construct of where the judge sits, like all of that matters.
Yeah, and I think I'll add just quickly, because it's a big deal for the architecture students. You know, I wish I learned earlier in my career, you know, when you frame up architecture with a capital A, all of a sudden it's a system, right? And it's also a system. Like when we talk about systemic racism or we talk about systemic slighting, it's not just law or people getting pulled over by the police unwarrantedly. What we're talking about is systems, right? And so the recording system of what we think architecture is is exactly that. It's not just a marble, beautifully designed marble edge with the right paint color. Like architecture had been existing in Africa, had been existing in other continents and other places without fancy materials, and had hosted civilizations long before the architectural history book that we all probably have in our locker somewhere, that started from a specific date representing only a specific type of people's ideas, to which we now think is architecture. And I think we keep talking about humanity, we keep talking about people. And so again, architecture is that computer, and it's more advanced to think about architecture in that way than thinking about architecture as the room that is built. That's why we're having this conversation, is this digital age and actually helping people. That door has been opened by architects thinking in this new millennium, sort of removing this idea of like perpetuating bad architecture or sort of like history, you know, in a way. And that's something we could unpack for a lot longer. I just wanted to throw like throw a wrench in this idea that architecture is holy and is, if we keep it in its previous state, will carry on baggage that's sort of warped our real legal system. It's warped our societal norms and also warped what we call architecture. So you have to be discerning about that.
Just to add one more thing to it, and this also ties back into Virgil's quote about every government needs an artist. So whenever lawyers or the legal profession talk about architecture or design, we always think of output. So you're creating the building. But what I found really crucial in these classes that we have offered architecture and law students is that we were mostly focused on processes and methodologies. So how an architecture student looks at the world, how they look at the problem questions and the solutions that they come up with. And I know that Oana focuses on this a lot as well. So maybe if you would like to speak a bit on that, on the importance of interdisciplinary work in solving these issues, which are interdisciplinary in themselves.
I'm actually happy you spoke up, because I was going to ask you, and I appreciate both Sheriece and Virgil's answers. They're really spot on, because Sheriece, the buildings you're describing, they were also designed by architects. So it, like most things, cuts both ways, right? And I think this is such an important topic to understand. And I've been learning a lot more about architecture from these conversations with Nóra and from actually dealing with non-architects, because I think we tend to be blind to our own skill sets at times, right? And I think the conversations, we're so used to talking to each other that we forget how to talk to anyone else. And with that, we forget what we can actually bring to the table and what our skill set is and how we can contribute. And we had a conversation earlier, a small lecture, which was really insightful and quite amazing. And one of the things that was being taught, you know, can architecture also just be a conversation? And in a way, I think what's interesting is architecture typically sees quote unquote success or the result as like a building. And if you don't have that, then it doesn't manifest itself. Kind of rethinking this notion of success, I think, is important both for the justice system. I remember right, it was a whole conversation with how do we even measure access to justice? How do we measure success in justice? And it's the same question with what is justice actually? And to have those as such ambiguous questions, I think raises then also such ambiguous answers or no clear answers, I think really shines a light onto us too. And how do we measure our contributions? And is it really just by what we were told architecture has been, by the myth of the architect? I always bring up in class, and I probably say it for the 5th time today, I hate that the center of the matrix is the architect with his white hair in his white suit. And in a way, that myth of the architect is just never going to manifest itself the same way. And it's under our skin. And I think we're really carrying that burden. I'm going to stop myself. So you're going to say something, Virgil, or?
No, we'll go to the next. These are good questions.
Oh man, there's a lot of questions, and maybe an important one is for everyone is, what is the role of a courthouse in present day if we are finding that iconicity and reinforcement of an image of higher power is no longer what we need? I think I'm curious to hear from everyone. Is the decorum an intrinsic part? Is it necessary, and to what end? What other aspects are, yeah.
I think on a logistic, that's why I love the data, and the Jay-Z quote, when culture can inform, just in a nutshell, because it's a data, like in our previous work, just talk about wait times, going to whatever office downtown to renew a passport, to file paperwork, to, there's an influx of data that can inform us. So my theory or feeling is, obviously we need to use that data to solve the problem. We don't have to guess. No one gets an extra gold star for just guessing at what the problems are. And I think we have data, we have computers to help us rationally analyze these models. So I think there's the pie that are dealing with paperwork and processes and helping people have a better life by whatever means they're having to file those, and then not having that flow in the same system as someone else going to court for something else. So then the caseloads can drop, and then the stress levels can sort of fall into a different, maybe there's a new system where these things are separated, so they're not flowing through the same pipeline. And it's just, I want to leave space for Sheriece and Nóra, but I think, analytical is what that brings to mind.
Nóra, you want to go? Oh, it's hard, right? There's data, and it tells you certain things, right? So you have what the data does, and then you have who controls the data and who makes the decisions about what happens. And the challenges that I think often we face is we have a system where there are a lot of people making a lot of decisions about what happens next, right? So we have what happens as it relates to technology, right? That doesn't flow across the whole system. That stays within one complex. That can stay within one courtroom. And so the challenges that we have here is that we know what the data says. We know what we think we should do about the data to change the system, but we are challenged by the fact that we have a lot of different people that have different perspectives about how to actually make that change. And so it can't even be done globally. And I think that the fact that we can't, the hardest part of changing the system is that we don't have one person, we don't have a system that's set up where one person says, change it, and then everything changes, right? That's what's really missing and what we do. And I think it kind of goes to the question and the issue of how we are structured. You have corporations. Corporations have presidents and CEOs. President and CEO says everybody jump, says how high, right? And so there's a person that is able to make a decision that happens across systems. We have a lot of stakeholders, as many court systems throughout the nation. There are a lot of stakeholders with varying powers that get to influence what actually happens next. And that is one of the most challenging parts of making changes within the system, dismantling systems, rebuilding systems, redesigning systems, right? Just take, for example, Quincy, right? When we get to Quincy, there's several courthouses, court departments that are going in there. There are a lot of different interests, and they all are competing over what floor people are going to go on, how big a particular space is. And so when you want to just kind of come in and do something that is so very simple, particularly our generators, like it's so very simple, like just fix it. Like it's like turning on the light. But it's hard, and it makes it really, really difficult. And I think that that's kind of our biggest challenge that we have in terms of fixing systems and making changes, just kind of overall.
I just hope that the court leadership and the legal profession will take more initiative in experimenting and maybe accelerating change as well, because, well, Sheriece and I both know how slow change is in the legal system. And I think now the question is, what is the role of the courthouse in the present day? So again, we come back to substance and form. If we agree upon substance, and that's a whole different discussion of what substance of justice or law is, then we can play around with form. And I hope we can maybe make a distinction in the future between those things, and then also through that way implement changes, because there will always be a place in society for some form of a courthouse. Because one of the essential things about the legal system is making your voice heard when you're a victim or whatever, when you're a litigant. And that key part, which is a key part of being a human being, that will always be a necessity in society. The question is more like, how will the courthouse in its shape and the form, how will that change in the future? Yeah. Oana, do you want to add anything?
Well, there's a good follow-up question. It's a trick follow-up question, which is, if you were given an infinite budget and told to change only one thing about the justice system, where would you start? I mean, on my end, the one thing that I kind of probably struggle with most is, can you just remove the financial part out of the justice system? Like, can justice just not depend on, can it not be a source of revenue? Can it not be about money? Can we remove that obstacle that so many people are facing?
I don't even see budget as the challenge in the system. I think that if there was an infinite amount of money and the same group of people existed in the system today, you still wouldn't see change. I don't care how much money you add to systems that are institutionally and systemically racist. There's no amount of money you could give to any legal system that is going to fix it. The problem are the people that are within the institution that need to be fixed. That is for me, that is ultimately what I see, right? The justice system is not just the court, right? The justice, and particularly for the criminal justice system, the most powerful person in the criminal justice system is really the prosecutor, right? The prosecutor is the determinant person who decides whether a case goes forward. But before you even get to the prosecutor, you have the police, right? And we know the foundations and we know the history of police operations in the United States of America, right? So we know that how they were set up, and we know that they are systemically racist as well. And we know that they racially profile, and we know that Black and brown people are disproportionately arrested, profiled, etc. So you have that police system that comes and asks for prosecutors to prosecute cases. And that's how people get into the system. Judges are often in the criminal side. They're just adjudicating. But then again, you have judges that came up through slavery, have ancestries in slavery, all of that, right? So you have all of these individuals that have created systems that are entirely racist. And they still exist in our systems today. So whether you paid them $150,000 or $500,000, or the legislative rollout billions of dollars into our system, if the leadership is still racist and the people that are within the system still have implicit and unconscious biases that they carry with them every single day, every interaction, every person that walks in is a criminal, every person that comes in and files a affidavit of indigency is just trying to get off on the system and doesn't want to pay the filing fee. If you have people within your system that actually believe that, and that's how they treat people based on that belief, it doesn't matter what you're paying them because they get a check every week. The reality is we have to change the people that are running these operations and that have the privilege and the authority and the power to actually impact people's lives, because that's where we're failing our society. People that are changing and have the ability to impact people's lives do not and are often unable to actually make fair and equitable decisions because they don't come with the lived experiences. They don't come with neutrality. They don't come with a human component to their decision. So I don't even think money doesn't matter to me at this point.
Thank you, Sheriece. Thank you for spelling it out. I think this is a great place to actually wrap it. And as we run out of time, I just want to ask you to say one, parting words to the student group listening, and any kind of closing argument is what they call.
Closing argument. What would I say? This justice has so many different meanings. It means so much to different people. And as you are coming up in your, academics and meeting people and listening, I will preach be kind and everything, but what I would say is really just there is so much to see, to learn, to experience, meet people, go places, travel. I grew up and there were no ceilings. I just said this the other day. I didn't have ceilings. There are no ceilings. There break glass ceilings, but there are no ceilings in this world. Whatever you want to learn, whatever you want to do, just do it. Be bold, be brave, be courageous. Go out on a limb, take risks, because we have really been boxed in, and it's time to just really just break out of these boxes, break out of tradition, and just literally live, see things, explore, just go, literally go. Is what I would say.
Thank you. Virgil, Nóra?
I'd just like to end on that note. I think what Sheriece said was perfect, so not going to add anything to it.
You're muted.
Just adding on to that as we close out, this conversation and this dialogue is at the forefront of change. It's just as important as anything you're reading in the newspaper or anything that you're seeing about the headlines and the news cycle. It's about a young generation being in a space to usher in new ideas. And I think it's important to not look at this coursework or this Zoom as just something to do for an hour. Out of it will birth the idea, because it's not going to happen outside of a conversation like this with someone to have it. And that the way that the modern world is built is we all have a voice. So take this coursework as just as a little bit of a joke. All your other classes you can do for fun, but this one will change the world in a way that is, and I mean that philosophically. All of us having a dialogue about something that helps our neighbor and ultimately helps ourselves. There's not many rooms to have conversations like that. So with that, thanks Oana for making the space, and thanks to all the other panelists, Nóra and Sheriece.
Thank you, Virgil. Thank you so much, Sheriece. Thank you, Nóra. This wouldn't have happened without any of you. And I know we're going to keep having these conversations, and hopefully in a couple of months' time, we can also talk more succinctly about the work. And with that, I'll pass it on to Brandon.
Wow, thank you, everyone. Oana, Nóra, Virgil, Sheriece. This has been a really inspiring and mind-opening conversation at the same time. Thank you to the audience as well for joining us. We hope you can all join us again next Thursday, March 25th at 6 p.m. for Conversations on Care with Cruz Garcia and Natalie Frankowski of the WAI think tank, presented in collaboration with Anna Miljacki and the Critical Broadcasting Lab. You can find all these events and the full list of lineups coming up at architecture.mit.edu. Come join us. Thanks, everyone.